Welcome to the National Audubon Society's Rowe Sanctuary on the Platte River in Gibbon, Nebraska. This is a vital location on one of the world's great animal migrations. Every year in late winter and early spring, most of the sandhill cranes on Earth use the Platte River as a stopover site on their northward migration. For the birds, it's a place of refuge, a place for socialization, and a place that helps ensure their survival. For people, a gathering of cranes along the river inspires awe, wonder, and the motivation to protect places for migrating birds that they need to survive their arduous journeys. Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Fitz. I'm the resident naturalist with explore.org. This is our first ever Sandhill Crane play-by-play, and it's brought to you by explore.org and our webcam partners and the staff at the National Audubon Society's Rowe Sanctuary. I'm joined today by two co-hosts from Rowe. First, let me introduce Amanda Hefner, who is the education manager there. Amanda, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. I'm excited to do this program.
Yeah, thanks for being here. We already can hear some cranes in the background, so we're hoping that we're going to have some sights of them flying in to roost for the evening. We're also joined by Marcos Stolfus, the center director at the Rowe Sanctuary. Marcos, how are you doing?
Doing all right. Thanks so much for the introduction, Mike. And we're very excited to have a chance to watch some cranes with you here tonight.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this. We've been planning this for, we first talked about it maybe a couple of months ago at least. And this is live footage that we're looking at right now. So we don't know exactly when the cranes are going to come in. We're going to talk about their dynamics and why maybe we're not seeing them right now, what happens to them throughout the rest of the year. We are just going to let, nature show us what it's going to show us today. But we also have other videos and footage to share with you about sort of crane behavior and how they maybe are surviving their migration journey, where they're going, for instance, what other things we might be able to see along the river. We're scheduled to be here for about 45 minutes or so, and we do invite our audience to ask us questions as well. So if you're curious about sandhill cranes or the Platte River or the place, then ask our experts here right now. Drop those questions in the chat. We have some helpful moderators that are looking for those questions during the program, and they'll send them in my direction today. First, let me introduce the location of the Rowe Sanctuary for everybody. So we're going to show a quick fly-in video where we are going to head to the mid-continent of North America to the Platte River in Gibbon, Nebraska. And the webcam at the Rowe Sanctuary is located just slightly downriver. Marcos, how far would you downriver would you say the webcam is from your center?
Oh, not probably not quite a full mile, a little more than a half mile for sure. And it's right along the south bank of the river, and kind of right by that pin on the screen. You can see that there's a pretty cool braided river ecosystem that's often right one of the spots where the cranes love to roost each night.
Yeah, it's a great spot to locate a webcam. And every morning, if I happen to tune in or I can do the rewind on the webcam, you get to see a lot of cranes. And if you haven't experienced it before, even in person, which I haven't, but online, it's still amazing to see. We have another image here. We'll remove these labels and just kind of go to a blank image with a star. This shows, again, the webcam location. I wanted to mark that for everybody, but I also wanted to point in the general direction downstream. So the webcam is located sort of upstream of the Rowe Center and a little bit to the southwest. And the camera itself, its line of sight is mainly going to be looking at the river corridor. Every once in a while, you can kind of see something maybe through the trees beyond the immediate vicinity of the river corridor itself. But where the blue is on the screen right now, that's basically sort of like the camera's rough line of sight. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking upriver, maybe downriver, across the river, and we have a wonderful camera operator who is helping us to bring that footage to you. So let's head back to the live camera right now and see what is happening on screen. Uh, Amanda, we can hear cranes. Uh, it's hard to see them. I think there's some roosting, maybe right now in the vegetation across the river. What happens, kind of at this time of the day with the cranes? What have they been doing during the day, and what can we expect the cranes to do later this evening?
Okay, so these sandhill cranes have been spending all day out in the fields, and wetlands and pastures and grasslands around Rowe. While they're here in Nebraska, they are foraging, they are feeding, they are resting. So some of the behaviors they exhibit are loafing, so conserving that energy. Here in Nebraska, they really enjoy eating a lot of the excess corn that we have out in the fields. But right now, during this time of the day, they actually will come into the wetlands and fields and grasslands that are closest to the river. We call it a secondary roost. So right now, they're waiting in these habitats that are around the river that are suitable for them, and they're waiting for the sun to get a little bit lower before they start scouting out a great roosting habitat for them in the river. So usually closer to sunset, they'll start lifting off these secondary roosts and flying the river corridor, searching for the perfect sandbar of that braided river that we just saw to land for the night.
And why would the river be such an important place for sandhill cranes? I mean, uh, we could look at the ducks in the foreground here and be like, okay, yeah, they're these are dabbling ducks, they're water birds. Sandhill cranes, they're not ducks. I don't know if many people would necessarily associate them as some birds that need water. They certainly will. They reproduce in wetlands. It's like sort of like their main habitat for reproduction. But why is the Platte River itself such an important area for the birds?
So the Platte River is located in an area that's a great stopover place for them on spring migration. So we're a little further north than their coastal and southern winter habitats. And so this location is great. There's a lot of food resources for them. And the Platte River has always been pretty much this pretty wide river channel with amazing sandbars. And so it provides a pretty slow moving flow, and also the river is not that deep. So historically, they always would say that the Platte River was a mile wide and an inch deep. It's not always like that now. It's definitely become more channelized, but it still provides amazing habitat for these sandhill cranes to roost on. They like to use that water as kind of an alarm system, so they can hear predators approaching, and they like to be able to see a long ways to see any predators that might be approaching over the evening. And so they choose to land in the wide areas of the Platte River where there's not a lot of trees or even vegetation on sandbars. So having bare sandbars is really important for them to feel safe.
And they're some of the largest birds in North America. Can you give us a rough estimate of their size and wingspan?
Absolutely. So sandhill cranes are around 6 to 10 pounds. Their wingspans are close to 6 feet, and so their height is around 3 to 4 feet. So they're pretty big birds. And what's amazing, I think, is their sound. So the sounds that sandhill cranes make is pretty extraordinary for their size. Even they have a really long trachea that actually coils up in their sternum, and their sound comes from their syrinx in their sternum. So it reverberates in their chest. So that's why you hear these loud, bugling, rattling sounds coming from these amazing birds. And they're very expressive. So they're just so fun to watch.
I love listening to them. I On the camera, like they can get so loud, especially like in the morning when you see thousands of them taking off all at once. It almost like blows out the microphone. Like it just starts, it overwhelms the microphone's ability to pick up the noise because it's so loud. I wanted to ask the both of you what it's like when you're there listening to the birds in person. Like how loud actually is it? Do you need to wear hearing protection, or is it just something that's like, oh yeah, it's loud, but it's not uncomfortably loud?
I wouldn't say that it's loud to the point of being uncomfortable, but when you're out in the viewing blinds, which are situated, not far from where the crane cam is, especially in the mornings, it'll often be true that big groups of birds will flush up off of the river kind of in one giant group or in several groups that are even across the whole river at a time. And the thing that's so interesting about it is sometimes you're looking maybe downstream and you hear this low sound before you notice anything coming up. And often it's the sound of all the wing beats. And the wings will be so loud that that's what immediately or initially draws your attention. And then as you look over and see where these birds are actually starting to come up in these huge numbers, like what's on the screen right now, what I find is that there's an initial level of volume as all these birds start making their calls, but then they often will start to kind of swirl around. And so they might initially all be going one direction, and if they're pointed at where you are, it's incredibly loud. But then as they start to turn, the quality of that sound really changes. And so it's kind of cool to be able to hear that. I don't know if that always comes across on the cam or not, but in person, it's a pretty incredible experience to be able to witness.
Yeah, it sure seems like it, and hopefully we'll get to see uh, some more birds coming into the river. I think, Amanda, maybe for the immediate time being, we might expect to see cranes at a distance, but it sounds like maybe we're not going to see cranes, maybe landing in the immediate vicinity of the camera in the next few moments. Is that a correct assumption on my part, or am I off base?
No, you're definitely correct. So the cranes, especially the past few evenings, with kind of we've had a cold front come through, and now we're seeing really warm temps. They might come in because they might be thirsty after a long day loafing and dancing and foraging. But for the most part, they've been landing closer to sunset, which is around kind of 7:45 tonight. But I think we will capture some amazing flyovers. We potentially could see them land and leave those secondary roosts. So there's definitely a shot at it. They're wildlife. They like to do what they like to do.
Well, that's one of the special things about webcams is that it is unedited, it's unfiltered nature. It's not like a documentary where they have maybe real footage, but they're piecing together a story, maybe not even using the same individual animals, but they're talking about like the same family throughout the whole uh, the whole documentary. So sometimes you got to be a little bit more patient, or not sometimes, but often you have to be a bit more patient with the live nature cams as something that's more curated for you. But we get to see all this amazing behavior on the cameras as well. And we did get an audience question that came in from Holly M, who was wondering, is there a hierarchy among the birds? I've been watching some cams where the cranes seem to boss bald eagles around. And I think anybody with a bird feeder can understand that, yeah, some species and some individuals are a bit bossier than others. What can you tell us about sandhill cranes? I mean, they're so large. I don't think there's many birds that would think about challenging an adult or even a full-grown juvenile.
Yeah, absolutely. Eagles actually are one of the predators that we see here on the Platte River for cranes. They're not trying to go for the healthy crane. So rather than maybe a hierarchy, I'd probably say it's more of a standoff, essentially.
Okay.
Um, those healthy sandhill cranes can sometimes get a mob-like mentality when they're all together to protect each other. That's why we see them roosting in such large numbers here on the Platte together. And here on the crate cam, we can see some of them doing their parachute landing, where they stick their legs out really straight and kind of use their wings as a parachute to come down. Um, but yeah, so I would say that they're kind of trying to be territorial against that bald eagle, show them that they're not afraid of that bald eagle. We definitely do see bald eagles scaring cranes, and one lone bald eagle can fly down the middle of the Platte River and cause a premature liftoff for our sandhill cranes. So, they really need to kind of stick up for themselves in front of that bald eagle a little bit. So you can see that. The cranes that the bald eagles are feeding on are most likely sick ones or weak ones from migration.
And there is, it's really important for many birds uh, to find safety in numbers, and that's one of the things that the cranes are doing along the river. It's I, this is such an important place for sandhill cranes. We got a couple of questions from people who are wondering about numbers of cranes on the river. So they're related. I'll kind of include them both together. But Rena wrote in and asked and said the Crane Trust counts all of the sandhill cranes on an 80-mile stretch of the river. Do we know how many cranes are staying in the camera range specifically? And then KBR wrote, what is the latest count, please? The cranes seem to arrive early this year. Is that weather related, or do we just not know? So yeah, a couple of different questions there, but maybe yeah, what's the latest count for cranes, and do we know about in the vicinity of the Rowe Sanctuary?
So, our partners at the Crane Trust are counting the cranes in an area known as the Big Bend Reach. So, it is that 80-mile stretch here in Nebraska of the Platte River. And they do, yeah, a weekly crane count. The latest one has around, I'm double checking to make sure my numbers are right. I think we're around 450,000 sandhill cranes in the area. And so, yeah, we're expecting that to kind of increase. What we've been noticing is that weather can definitely play a factor. Also, kind of those disruptors in our ecosystem. So, if there's drought south of us, that makes those cranes realize as they're migrating that, hey, I might want to get to Nebraska maybe a little bit sooner for the resources there. So we've been seeing the sandhill cranes come earlier to the Platte and stay longer. And so, our crane season is, potentially expanding a little bit for the viewing. I'm sure Marcos can add how amazing our early season crane viewing from our blinds were. There was just so many cranes here. The first week we offered tours, it was a pretty unbelievable experience.
Yeah, and early in this season, it's also not uncommon at all for us to have, tens of thousands or even, upwards of 100,000 waterfowl, like especially snow geese and cackling geese and other species. And so that's kind of a fun thing for guests who come early in the year to see, and I'm sure that the viewers would have been able to enjoy that as well. In general, on our stretch of the river here at Rowe Sanctuary, which is largely going to be within view of the camera, but not entirely. I'd say it's not uncommon for us to have tens of thousands of cranes that are roosting overnight. And kind of at the upper range, we a few times have had maybe 200,000 on our specific stretch, but that's kind of on the high end. It's going to be more common that we've got 50,000, 70,000, maybe some 100,000s in there. Week by week, that's going to vary, and year by year, that adjusts quite a lot as well.
Well, that's amazing. Yeah, that's got to be an amazing scene to have that many cranes in such a short stretch of the river. Amanda, you were mentioning weather and how that affects
Mhm.
um, cranes. This today was a very warm day for you. We were talking about it before the program began, how you had temperatures in the high 70s where you were, although it was much colder. um, recently. So does that have much effect on the crane's behavior? You mentioned that maybe they're going to be thirsty. They've been feeding in agricultural fields throughout the rest of the day, warm day, so maybe they're going to want to come down to drink water. Does that also affect their longer term goals as far as like migration? Might you see them leaving the Platte River area sooner than they would like on an average basis if you have long stretches of warm weather?
Definitely, potentially. And I do want to correct myself. I did look up the latest crane count, got the real numbers. So the last count was 494,000 sandhill cranes. So yeah, we're close to that 500,000 birds here at this time. But yeah, weather does definitely impact them. So, the days that we see sandhill cranes wanting to continue on their migration are those warm days where we get those winds that push them north. Migration takes so much energy. And so these sandhill cranes are pretty smart and they will kettle similar to other bird species that are conserving energy and ride those thermals. And so when we get winds on a nice warm day pushing north, they'll take advantage of that. Now we're still pretty decently into the season. This is normally when we see the largest numbers of cranes here, so I'm not too worried about them leaving just yet. But towards the latter part of March and into early April, anytime we have a wind that's pushing to the north and some warm weather, you can see mass departures of sandhill cranes from the Platte.
And I will jump in just to mention that, we say that each individual bird is going to be here on the Platte and in the surrounding habitat for somewhere between 2 to 4 weeks. And so it's like for today, for example, it was a beautiful warm day. And there were quite a number of cranes that were starting to exhibit that kettling behavior that Amanda said. And so, we don't ever exactly know which birds are coming in and which birds are leaving, but you can kind of get a sense of that, especially as you watch for kettling and as those numbers over the whole valley kind of come to a peak and ebb down. But yeah, there's definitely some early birds and some late birds. And with some of those trends, it's harder to distinguish exactly, when they're coming and going.
And we're going to try to get to some more audience questions here in just a little bit. We're back to live footage now. It looks like we have some of those flocks of cranes just starting to come in. I'm wondering, a little bit about their social life in these situations. Like, who's the one who's like sort of the leader leaving the agricultural fields, coming back down to the river, and maybe even in the morning too, like when they decide to take off? Is there a leader, or is it it seems like more of a collective decision for them?
I think you'd have to ask them.
Okay.
It doesn't to me,
Wish we could.
from what I've seen, it doesn't seem to me that there's necessarily a leader. What is true is that they are incredibly social. And so there is a certain kind of behavior where if they're standing in a group, they'll kind of do like a lean intention. They'll lean forward with their neck and their head. There's a great shot right there. And that's basically their way of signaling to the other members of their group, especially their partner or their offspring, that, hey, I'm thinking about getting ready to go here. So that leaning right there is really how they're telling the other group that let's maybe get out of here. Now, what I've kind of noticed personally is it seems as though if there's a group that starts off, they're often kind of at the edge of a large gathering. And there sometimes is a bit of a peel that occurs where the outside will start and then it'll kind of go towards the inside. But sometimes none of them leave except for a small group, and sometimes all of them go. So that's really hard to know, like what's going on there or what the individual dynamics are. But for sure, if you're starting to see that head go forward, that's the way that they're going to be talking to each other about getting ready to take to the skies.
And while the cranes are coming into the river now, I think this is a really great opportunity before we again get back to some audience questions to talk about the importance of Platte River to cranes and the surrounding area. I mean, it's sort of like this wonderful set of conditions for the birds, Amanda, because you have like the river corridor. It's very shallow for them. They can roost in the river. Good lines of sight. They can be here in large numbers, but there's also food available for them. Can you talk about like what the surrounding habitat is, which essentially is or it includes a very human modified landscape, and how are the cranes taking advantage of that situation?
It's if there's any if there's any species I think that shows adaptability during spring migration in Nebraska, it's the sandhill cranes. So historically, we would have had lots of wetlands, wet meadow habitats along the Platte River, lots of prairie everywhere, mixed grass prairie. We wouldn't have had a lot of trees except right along the riverbank. Definitely no forests in this part of the of Nebraska. And so the cranes historically would have utilized a lot of that wetland habitat. They're omnivores, so they'll be very opportunistic with whatever they can find to give them some energy while they're here. Their goal here is to, to consume a lot. They consume close to 20% of their body weight while they're here, trying to fatten up so that they can continue on their migration safely. And so what's really cool, is that we've gone through massive habitat changes here in the Platte and landscape change, and yet the cranes still come and they're doing well. So cranes, about close to 90% of their diet while they're here in Nebraska is waste grains or corn, or other, some crops that have been grown here. Our farmers aren't leaving that crop for them. It's just kind of what has fallen out during harvest or left in the fields. And so the cranes have really utilized that in their diet. They're also looking for any opportunistic ventures where they can seek out any small mammals or amphibians or anything like that. They will eat the tubers of plants. They're looking for snails in those wetlands. They might be getting a lot of their calorie intake from the waste crops or corn that's left in the fields, but they need protein. So they're going to be finding that protein in those wetlands, those prairies, the other habitat that Rowe and several other conservation organizations here in the valley protect.
Yeah, Marcos, I was, reading a little bit about sandhill crane diet, and they are, like Amanda said, they are very much omnivores. I look at them kind of when they're walking around, like these large, tall birds like this. I don't know, they they bring me closer to like imagining and making the mental connection between them and dinosaurs, because birds are sort of an offshoot of a group of theropod dinosaurs. So yeah, if for me it's interesting to see how they are, again, opportunistic in that sense, looking not only for that waste grain, but they're also looking for any animal protein that they might be able to capture.
Yeah, and I would add to that that they're in that way they're generalists, right? So they're not, only eating a certain kind of, lichen or, a certain food source that some species may have adapted for. They're really up for whatever. And so that I think adds to their adaptability in a lot of ways, as Amanda has talked about earlier this evening.
Yeah, and then, hopefully that helps to answer an audience question that came in recently. Somebody just asked, what is their preferred meal? And if they're going to be along the Platte River, going maybe for some of that waste grain in the surrounding agricultural fields, but not, they're going to be, opportunistic and generalist omnivores looking for other opportunities as they into uh, come into range for them. Another recent question that just came in, Amanda, um, is about, or somebody was wondering, do they clash with farmers as they consume food in the fields? As far as I understand it, this time of the year, not so much. But again, what do I know about cranes? Very little. That's why the both of my co-hosts are here. So, what do we know about potential conflicts with people in that sense?
Well, we are really fortunate here in Nebraska that we don't have a lot of conflict with the cranes and our agriculturalists. So March is too early, even though we've been talking about very warm temperatures lately. It's too early for most of our farmers to be out in the field. And so there is plenty out there for our cranes to be consuming. And cranes don't seem to be bothered by cattle either. And so in our grasslands and our cornfields, our farmers like to put a lot of their cattle out on them. We see cranes actually picking through cow pies, looking for those insects, looking for those, corn that's gone through the cow's ruminant and everything like that. And so, they found a way to work in harmony in a way. And here in Nebraska, that's a big deal. Agriculture is a really big part of the state. And also, Nebraska is a special place for cranes because cranes aren't hunted here in the state. They're protected. And so it's illegal to harass a sandhill crane. And so they're very much a part of, the state's identity. And so they're protected. We don't have a hunting season, and there's not a lot of conflict, unlike other populations of sandhill cranes where they're actually going to nest in the northern part of the US, like in areas like Wisconsin, where cranes can actively be seen taking seed out of the ground as farmers are planting or, foraging on freshly planted and growing crops. And so we're pretty fortunate here that there's plenty for everyone and it doesn't seem to impact our farmers too much.
And while we were talking about that, we did see a few groups of cranes kind of land right at the base of those trees on the far side of the river. Was that an
Mhm.
example of like the secondary roosting that we were talking about earlier?
Yes, exactly. They're coming into the river valley. They're kind of scoping out some locations. They might land off into the habitats nearby, getting ready to come into the river valley.
Mike, one thing that we might want to mention is the maintenance that we actively do on the river channel itself to make sure that it is a suitable habitat for the cranes. I don't remember if we chatted about that with you already or not.
Yeah, yeah, and you were able to helpfully provide some examples of what's going on because a lot of wildlife management and conservation has to be active, enhancing habitat for certain species or groups of species, or enhancing habitat for many different species. Um, excuse me. And one of the things that you were mentioning before the program was like actually going in with mechanical equipment, and you did. There's a process called disking. Can you just maybe describe what that might be?
Yeah, so river disking is essentially trying to mimic something that would have been happening naturally in this ecosystem. And what it involves is having a piece of heavy equipment, usually a tractor, used in farming or agriculture, and that piece of equipment will be dragging behind it an implement called a disc, which is used to turn up and churn the soil. And in this shot right here, you can get a really good sense of where that disc has already passed and where it hasn't. Where it hasn't has a lot of vegetation, nice, thick, lush, green, especially in this case, herbaceous vegetation that has taken its opportunity to germinate and to start to grow. And while that's a very natural part of ecological succession and a natural part of the growing season, it's actually the case where here in Nebraska, um, historically, there would have been such huge flooding events each spring that those huge volumes of water, and then the ice that would have maybe caused jams and kind of scoured these sandbars, that would have served to keep the sandbars free of vegetation in kind of a shifting sandbar pattern, which is why we call the Platte a braided river ecosystem. Now, these days, there's not as much water that comes through the river channel. And so that doesn't happen naturally. And so we do get the vegetation come up. And so to keep it suitable habitat for the cranes, we work with partner organizations like an organization called Platte River Recovery Implementation Program. and they help us to contract out to get this disking done to try to mechanically do what would have happened naturally, all to make it suitable for the cranes and to keep them coming in year after year.
And you mentioned there's also a couple of other techniques when we were talking before the program, things like wetland restoration, prescribed fire, and grazing as well. How are those things enhancing sort of habitat for cranes and other species?
Yeah, well, as I think Amanda was alluding to, the cranes are using habitat on either side of the river channel itself, especially for feeding and foraging during the day. And I should mention that, the cranes are the star of the show here at Rowe Sanctuary, of course, but there's a lot of birds that live here year round that are grassland species in particular. And so a lot of our habitat here is really, our habitat management, should say, is really focused on maintaining the grassland habitats, trying to produce wet meadows. A lot of times that involves kind of side channels that would have been historic river scars. Now we call them sloughs or kind of backwaters. And that provides important habitat for waterfowl, for lots of different kinds of wildlife. And especially when that can happen right adjacent to grasslands that are, wide open, intact, open spaces, that really gives us a rich ecosystem here for all kinds of different wildlife to thrive. Not to mention that the cranes will use parts of that for their foraging as well.
And it looks like you're in for a really great sunset tonight. Hopefully that does happen for you. Sometimes the cameras that we use on Exploded.org, they can kind of enhance the colors a little bit, so they can look, excuse me, perhaps a bit brighter than what we see or what you would see in person. But it's just a beautiful scene and a beautiful soundscape right now. We have a few minutes left in our program today. I want to thank everybody for submitting your questions. We got too many to answer, unfortunately. But one of the big things that we probably should talk about before our program concludes is also, where are the cranes going? We talked about how this is a stopover location on their springtime migration. Amanda, can you talk a bit about their Sandhill migration route? Because Lisa wrote in and was asking, could you name their migration pattern location for us? And then somebody else was asking, where are their breeding grounds? North Dakota, Canada, question mark?
Absolutely. So this population of the sandhill cranes that come through the Great Plains in the U.S. Through the Central Flyway are known as the mid-continent population. So these birds are going from the coast down along Texas and into Mexico, New Mexico, those areas. They're migrating north, and they're stopping over here in Nebraska while they head up to their nesting grounds, which range from anywhere from the upper 48 of the United States to into Canada, and then even all the way up to Alaska and Siberia. So in this population of the mid-continent, we have two subspecies of sandhill cranes. We have graders and lessers. And what's really amazing, not to not shout out the graders, they definitely are going to nesting grounds that are in the upper United States, into Canada a little bit, but the lessers make this amazing journey all the way up to Canada, Alaska, and even Siberia. And so they're doing an amazing thousands of miles of this migration route. And then when they actually, incubate their eggs and hatch their chicks, they have a shorter time period to even teach those chicks everything they need to know before fall migration. So I love to shout out the lesser sandhills cranes a little bit, because they make such an amazing journey all the way to, potentially Siberia. So these cranes are moving for sure. And you can see a lift off right there on the crane cam. Something might have spooked them, or they might be getting ready to start flying through the river valley, looking for a nice place to roost. A lot of the times at this time of night, you'll also see them come back and land on those secondary roosts again. So you might see some of that behavior.
And you were just mentioning, the difference between greater and sandhill or greater and lesser sandhill cranes. There was a question that came in earlier about that. Leanne C8054 wrote in and said, "Can you describe the difference between greater and lesser sandhill cranes and their territories?" So maybe there's differences in their breeding um, range. It sounds like. Are we looking for differences in size? Is that something that we could see if the cranes were closer to us, like on the camera?
Yeah. There is a difference in size. Uh, the graders are a little bit bigger than the lessers, and the lessers are definitely migrating longer distances. Now, even though I've watched multiple sandhill crane seasons here in Nebraska, I'm not very good at really telling the differences in size when you have thousands of cranes in front of you. But definitely with those nesting grounds, there's that difference where the graders are sticking closer to the Canadian US border, the lessers are migrating deeper, deeper into Canada and up in Alaska and Siberia. I do want to point out, as we're seeing all these different crane groups flying in, most sandhill cranes are flying with their families. So we'll have the female and the male, which we call a roan and a mare. The male mares are the females. They're normally flying with last year's chick. So that's why you see usually groups of two. That's usually a mated pair, and then sometimes groups of three. They will group up together during this time of the day, as they're coming in. They might leave with the group that they were foraging with, but notice right now we see two flying across the screen in some smaller groups. Those are usually the family groups of our sandhill cranes.
And one thing that I would add to that, that again, I'm not sure how well this translates through the microphone of the crane cam, but you can often distinguish the juveniles as they fly with their parents by their call. And if you're ever, in person able to hear this, or if it does come through the cam, there's a squeaky, high, almost whistling call that goes a lot higher than the typical call of the adults. And if you do hear that, that's the juvenile who's flying on with them. And you can kind of think of it in simple terms as like their voice hasn't changed yet. They haven't matured all the way.
Hmm.
And so I find it really special to hear that and know that that's a first year bird who's making its way north for the very first time, learning this migration pathway and following their parents back to the area where they must have been hatched from.
This is really a beautiful scene. I usually don't watch the cam at this time of the day. I'm usually, if I sit down at my desk in the morning, that's when I'm turning it on to see them leaving the river in the morning. But yeah, the colors, the sunset, the flocks that are coming in, I'm really enjoying this scene right now. We only have, a couple of minutes left in our program. Got a ton of audience questions we couldn't get to. Thank you for everybody, thank you everyone who has submitted questions for us. But I just have just a couple of more questions um, for Amanda and Marcos, because we know that that birds in many parts of North America, many different populations and groups of birds aren't actually doing that well right now. There was a report from the National Audubon Society that came out last year, their State of the Birds, and it cataloged that bird populations in North America have declined among almost all major groups. So, and this is on top of the fact that there's 3 billion fewer birds using North America now compared to the 1970s. So, in my lifetime, essentially, bird populations in North America are far less numerous than they were, um, a few decades ago. However, sandhill cranes, they seem to be like one of these conservation success stories. But can you maybe tell us overall about how their numbers compare today? How are the populations doing? It seems like the mid continent population is doing very well.
We're pretty fortunate that most populations of sandhill cranes are stable or increasing. There still is a threat of habitat loss. And so, when we protect our sandhill cranes and their habitat, we're also protecting habitat for those bird species that are having major issues with loss of grasslands, especially here in Nebraska. And so, making sure that we have great conservation efforts put into stopover habitat like the Platte, And those habitats around it is really vital, not only for cranes, but also for other species. So here in Nebraska, we have the piping plover and least tern that depend on those bare sandbars. And by doing conservation practices and active management to protect and provide habitat for sandhill cranes, we're also helping those species too. So, everything's kind of connected to everything else. I will say that the the more localized populations of sandhill cranes that are in Mississippi and Cuba are pretty vulnerable, and they might potentially be listed as endangered, in fact. But the rest of the populations of sandhill cranes and all those different migration pathways are doing pretty well.
And I know in the Northeast United States where I live, sandhill cranes are starting to essentially recolonize places where maybe they were hunted out of, 100 years ago, or perhaps even farther back in time. So if we give the birds the opportunity, many of them can take advantage of that situation and come back and rebound from population lows. But we got to protect their habitat, and we got to find space for them alongside us. Uh, One more thing that I wanted to talk about with both of you, Marcos, I'll throw this question to you first, but I'm wondering, how can people help ensure that the future is one full of sandhill cranes, and not, and in that it does include scenes like this, so future generations are able to enjoy hundreds of thousands of cranes along the Platte River.
Yeah, well, I think one thing that's really important to me as an employee of Audubon is knowing that we're part of an organization that works hemispherically. And what I mean by that is, we're working really hard here in Nebraska to preserve this habitat and prepare it for the cranes during this particular part of their life cycle and of their migration. But they're not here year round. They've come from somewhere and they're going somewhere else. And that's true for all bird species who migrate. And I think it's important to know that Audubon, for example, works across whole flyways, that there are centers and initiatives that are habitat promoting that are happening not just in the US, but in Central and Latin America and South America, and beyond. So one way that I think that people can support habitat conservation is to find an organization like Audubon or another one that's local to where they are, and to find ways to connect and engage. That may be talking about it with someone who's never heard about it. It may be financially contributing, maybe volunteering. And so, whether that's an Audubon chapter near where some of the viewers are, or whether that's a local nature center that they are connected with, all of those are important ways for people to express their love of the natural environment, for phenomena like these that we're seeing right here today as all these cranes start to flock in and sun starts to set.
Do you have anything to add, Amanda?
I mean, I think Marcos just said it so well. This work is so important because there aren't really borders with migration, right? So I love that that's part of the work that Audubon does here, very hemispheric. And I think that's a lesson we can all learn from, especially with Audubon doing a lot of education programming. That's what I do as the education program manager here at Rowe Sanctuary, is just being able to share the amazing stories and resiliency of these bird species, especially these sandhill cranes, which look like they might be finally coming in a little bit.
It's an absolutely beautiful scene, and I think those are great points to conclude our program with. Humans love to draw lines on maps. Wildlife doesn't recognize those lines at all. So we need to think more globally, I think, for protecting migratory species and other wildlife across the planet. And the sandhill cranes are just a great example uh, of what we can do for wildlife if we commit to it. I want to thank my guests and experts for taking the time out of their day to join me. First, I'll thank Amanda Hefner, who is the education manager at the Rowe Sanctuary. Thank you very much, Amanda, for being here.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
And I will apologize to Marcos because I know I fudged your last name. at the beginning of the program. So sorry about that. But Marcos Stoltzfus, the center director at the National Audubon Society's Rowe Sanctuary. Marcos, thanks so much for being here.
It was a great pleasure. We're very thankful for the opportunity and look forward to doing it again.
Yeah, we'll be back on April 1 for another one of these programs. So please join us then. Same crane channel, same crane time. And until then, my name is Mike Fitz with explore.org. Thanks for joining us today. You can watch the cranes anytime at explore.org. So join us there if you want to see more of this. Have a great night, everybody.